Right, so we'll move now to item 12, which is the additional agenda item. John is coming forward. And now there was obviously reasons for the lateness. The committee agenda was almost preparing two different items, one on height, one on the light rail corridor. But then we had the letter and then the minute from the IHP over the weekend, and so that has had to change completely where we were heading, which meant a rush for staff to try and get us something in this committee, otherwise we'd have to wait a month to respond and everyone is confused. So I might just let John lead off here, and then there'll be, I'm assuming, a lot of questions. Kia ora.
Okay, kia ora tata. Good morning, Mayor and councillors. So, proposed plan change 78, I know you're all very familiar with it, or pretty familiar with it, and so I won't try and summarise what the plan change does, but certainly happy to take any questions on the substance of the plan change if that assists later on. But really this late report is a response to recent events. First of all, you'll recall the Chair and Deputy Chair of the committee requested an extension of time from the Minister for the Environment and Minister for Resource Management Reform for this process. That extension was seeking that decision-making by Council would be extended from next March through to March 2026. And the reason we were seeking the extension was that a number of factors, really. First of all, new government has stopped the Auckland Light Rail project, and that's a core, I guess, missing component of Plan Change 78 that we as Council had to do something with, and still have to do something with that area of the city in terms of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which this all sits within. Secondly, there's a clear signal from the coalition government that medium density residential standards, which are again another core element of proposed Plan Change 78, will become optional for Tier 1 fast growth councils such as Auckland Council. The details of that are not yet clear, but that's certainly something that's in the coalition agreements and stated as a top priority for the coalition government over the next 90 days to make some decisions on the medium density residential standards. We know that that is almost certainly going to come with some caveats. It's signals from the Minister for Resource Management Reform and looking at the various policy documents of the National Party in particular. It's fairly clear that it won't be a carte blanche, unlikely to be a carte blanche. You can remove all of medium density residential standards with no qualifications, but until we see more detail, we can't advise you or confirm that in its entirety. So the Mayor also followed up with a letter to the Minister for Resource Management Reform, building on what the Chair and Deputy Chair had sought and reinforcing the need for at least another year extension so that we can really see where the government policy lands, what changes are going to be made to legislation so we can make sensible decisions about proposed Plan Change 78, including hopefully the ability to get on and strengthen the natural hazard rules and restrictions that sit in the industry plan. As you know, there's quite an important bit of work happening in the background on that, and we've explained to you previously that there is a barrier in the RMA linked to this plan change that prevents Council from getting on and toughening up the rules for areas that are subject to natural hazards. So that's quite a few moving parts there. So response from the Minister for RM Reform was that he has granted the 1 year extension for decision making. That's great. That takes it right through to March the year after next. But since then we've had the independent hearings panel who's hearing all of the submissions on this plan change in the room and the floor downstairs, respond to the Minister's letter and say, well, look, Minister, you're granting the extension. You've put some expectations on the Council in your response. Our reading of those expectations is it's a bit unclear as what they've said. And we really, as the independent hearings panel, don't feel that they can progress the hearings on Plan Change 78 any further. So the Minister seems to be saying, is saying, progress as much of Plan Change 78 as you possibly can. In particular, the parts of the plan change that deal with what's called walkable catchments around the city centre, the metropolitan centres, and the train stations and the busway stops. So Minister's saying progress as much of that as is, I think, either practicable or possible. Just can't recall the exact words, it's in the report. The independent hearings panel has come back straight away with a view that they don't believe that anything else can be progressed. They've heard submissions on the city centre zone, and that is quite a big part of the plan change as well. I mean, this plan change cuts across the whole of the urban area. The city centre zone itself had all the major waterfront landowners submitting and presenting swathes of expert evidence. Council was in there as well. The hearings finished a few weeks ago. Those hearings alone would have been well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars in council costs, let alone the submitters who participated. So as officers, we feel that the city centre is an area within the plan change that could progress now to a decision. To have to put a new plan change out sometime in the future when the law is changed and include the city centre again and have all of those hearings again seems a real waste of time, resource and effort. There is no medium density residential zoning or standards in the city centre. It is ring-fenceable in our view. It's discrete enough, and the changes that Plan Change 78 brings about are pretty positive. They're enabling more height and intensity of development in the city centre, including all the waterfront areas right up to Karangahape Road, the university and the western part of the CBD. So there's some positives in the plan change for the city centre. We think that can be progressed as officers, but we think anything beyond that starts to get very problematic because you're starting to get into parts of Auckland that may be impacted by a future plan change that this council may choose to initiate once we know what changes the government is going to make to the RMA for intensification and for housing in particular. So it just, in our view, there are three options and discussed in the report. Unfortunately, this isn't. Oh, it always helps to switch the thing on. Yep. Okay, so apologies, yeah, far too much text on this sort of slide, but really it's probably just the headlines, and I can speak to the three options that we've looked at since the Minister granted the extension very recently, and then the hearings panel came off the back of that within a couple of days, I think, to say, well, here's our view as the hearings panel, and here are some questions we have as a hearings panel about what council and the government is intending to do. So option one would be basically to box on with everything in Plan Change 78, and that would include, the first step would be to do a variation to Plan Change 78 to pull the light rail corridor, which is the missing piece of the plan change. So that's all of the land from the city centre to Mangere through Balmoral, Mount Roskill, Mangere and out to the airport. That was excluded from the plan change at the time because the council believed, was given the indication that there would be confirmation of light rail down that corridor and stops on the light rail that would require more intensification than you would do without it. Well, now that there is change of government policy and no light rail proposed, we would have to box on with a variation to the plan change for a large swathe of the city that's missing, invite submissions on that, and allow that variation to catch up with the rest of the region. So that's option one. Issues like natural hazards and strengthening those rules and responding to the government changes around medium density housing, they would have to happen later once this whole process gets through and the whole plan change for the whole of the region becomes operative. So advantages, I guess you can take this intensification planning instrument, as it's called, get it all the way through, get it operative probably by middle of next year, mid to late 2025. That's assuming there are no judicial reviews on the process, but yep, potentially mid to late next year, the whole thing and all of the intensification that this plan change enables from the city centre, including the light rail corridor and the rest of the urban area, would become operative. And I guess with that, you get quite a bit of additional capacity for housing in Auckland, some commercial development, additional capacity, and some of it aligns with the council's own strategic documents, such as the Auckland Plan and the regional policy statement. So, but on the disadvantages side, it's going to delay this natural hazards plan change because by the time you put out a variation for light rail, allow that to catch up, we are talking mid to late next year before this whole plan change could become operative. and it's only at that point that we could do a toughening of the rules around natural hazards because of that restriction in the RMA. The other big issue is the significant cost to hear all of the evidence and all of the submitters. So we've heard from dozens of submitters on the city centre, but there are 2,400 submitters, I think it is, across the rest of the region. So all of those submitters will start to get involved in hearings about all sorts of issues and topics. Council will have to spend significant resource on the hearings, and those hearings will go for multiple days, weeks and months to get through everything. So there's a lot of cost there. And I guess there's going to be a lot of confusion amongst the submitters, but the wider public as to, and those living or with an interest in the light rail corridor as to why council is boxing on with this process, medium density residential standards, potentially doing some upzoning and intensification in the light rail corridor when we know there are hazards in that area, but we can't toughen up the rules. So those are the disadvantages. So we're not recommending option one, but legally that is possible, and under the law, that is as it currently stands, that is probably, that's the one that's most fits within the law as it currently stands. Oh, I think you're going to have to flick that, Sandra, sorry. Option two. Okay, well, it is option two, not option one. The slide's confusing there, but it is an option two, so apologies for that. Option two is that one I touched on before. We think you can get that city centre through, not have to revisit that in the future, bank that one, get the additional opportunities. The hearings panel has perhaps got a bit of a question mark around that, but we feel that we could present to the hearings panel a case for completing the task of the city centre and then council making its decisions on the city centre. So we've got advantages in terms of that increase in intensification and opportunities for development in the city centre. We can get on and address natural hazards a bit earlier, probably March, April next year instead of mid to late next year. We're avoiding those significant costs of kind of hearing a whole lot of issues around Plan Change 78 now and then hearing them again in the future once the council considers that option of natural hazards, that option around medium density residential standards, figures out how that weaves in with natural hazards. So, and again, it avoids that public confusion and concern as to why the council is boxing ahead with medium density residential down the corridor across the rest of the region when there may be an option to do something different. Well, there will be an option, but we just don't know that option at this stage. Disadvantages, I guess, that outside the city centre, there are some opportunities in Plan Change 78 for intensification in some really good places well served by public transport. It'll take a bit longer for those areas, or it would take a bit longer for those areas to get the benefit of a plan change. And option three really just builds on option two. It is starting to see, well, is there more of Plan Change 78 that could be progressed without starting to create duplication, costs, and so on. We don't believe that there is, but because I think the more you start putting in the mix, the walkable catchments, for example, once we start having hearings on those, in the future, if there's another plan change, the issues are going to be, similar issues are going to be raised again. So this one has the advantage of not just city centre becoming operative and all the intensification, additional intensification there, those walkable catchments around the metropolitan centres, the train stations, the North Shore busway and the Eastern busway stops would come on stream earlier than option two. We would be able to get on and strengthen the provisions around natural hazards, but there are those disadvantages of starting to create confusion amongst the public as to why council is boxing ahead. Because medium density residential standards actually sit within the walkable catchments as well. They're not just in the wider suburban area. The way the plan change is written, the medium density is intertwined even with the walkable catchments. Because some of the zoning in the walkable catchments is residential, a lot of it, and the RMA required us to incorporate medium density even into the highest intensity residential zones that sit in those walkable catchments. So probably captured most of them. There is natural justice concerns about this option that, starting to make decisions about the walkable catchments outside of the light rail corridor, it might predetermine how we deal with walkable catchments within the light rail corridor. So if you have an interest in the land between city centre and Māngere through Sandringham, Balmoral, Mount Roskill, and you haven't submitted on Plan Change 78 because you're waiting to see what was going to be proposed to that area, you're not part of this process. If council, if the hearings panel starts hearing submissions about walkable catchments across the rest of the region and council makes decisions on that, then when it comes to deal with the light rail corridor, those people would potentially argue that it's all been predetermined and they weren't involved in that process. So we think that if you box on with option 3, it has that problem there. So those are the 3 options. We are recommending an option 2, which is essentially agreeing with some of the things the independent hearings panel is saying, that really there's not a lot more that can be progressed other than the city centre. There are some real positives in getting the city centre through. Both options 2 and 3 do rely on ongoing discussions, fairly serious discussions with the government around changes to the RMA to enable this alternative pathway to option 1. So that's what I've tried to describe there in that left-hand column for option 2 and 3. Really, it does require that engagement with government to really to enable the legislation for options 2 or 3 to occur, because they don't fit well with the legislation as it currently sits, which says essentially continue on with your 1-year extension. So those are the options and some of the issues. So happy to take questions.
Kia ora. Thank you, John, and I thank you and the team for constantly trying to find your way through this complex process. And I do want to acknowledge some of the other things. We did write to the previous minister, Minister Parker, around hazards, because he thought that we could downzone as part of Plan Change 78 with the hazards, which under the law we could not. And then this is why we wrote and reminded this minister also that we would need legislation change to do what is requested of us for these 3 different things. So the way that I believe that there is as the Mayor's manifesto said, that there is support for us to continue, and the government has been clear that we need to continue with MPSUD. What the government has now given us options on is MDRS, and I believe there is a majority and the Mayor supports that direction to remove MDRS in some areas. But the feedback we need to be careful is that the Minister and MFE have been clear that the new baseline is basically what we have out notified. So the issue is where we remove capacity, we need to add capacity. And these are all the questions and queries we will need to find out through the legislation or what is proposed. But that is, we're not intentionally been trying to delay capacity. We're trying to add in all these complex things that the legislation doesn't allow us to do or vary. And the issue is that people, as you say, John, will be submitting or attending hearings that may change and then have to do it all again. So it is rather complex. To help try and deal with that complexity, we'll have some questions, and we need to take time. I will try my best. I think if we can try our best not to veer completely back to last term's decisions and where this all came from, try and keep it to where we are now, but obviously those 2 things cross over. Councillor Fletcher is first up. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Chair. Thank you. And I thank the officers for outlining these options. But what I'm curious to know, because it was sort of foreshadowed in February in our correspondence, why the officers haven't put up an option 4. And the option 4 would be to try and, I suppose, take Plan Change 78 off life support. You've outlined all of the complexities, the complete waste, the need for certainty, the muddle. We would have the opportunity to upzone, putting the power back to Auckland to prioritise upzoning where we've got infrastructure and where it's appropriate. But I'm just curious why officers foreshadowed an option of withdrawing Plan Change 78 altogether in earlier correspondence, but today you haven't put that option to us. I'm respectful of the parliamentary process and so forth, but why have you not given us that option in terms of advocacy?
Through the Chair, Councillor Fletcher, I'll answer, and John, please step in. So, Councillor Fletcher, I think there's probably two elements here. One is, you know, the Minister for Resource Management Reform, Minister Bishop, has been clear that in both his speeches, the letter we've received, and so that's really been happening in the last couple of months this year, that he expects councils to continue in some way and to focus on capacity. And he mentions this 30-year capacity, which we've still got some lack of clarity on, but he's certainly wanting to drive councils to continue to deal with, the housing crisis, as he puts it. The second element to it, though, so I guess we are trying to be reasonable and helpful to you in not suggesting that we wipe it entirely away. That is still your decision. We just felt that perhaps wasn't helpful advice. The second element, though, I think, is option 2 is really a resetting of the current Plan Change 78 so that we can do the integrated look at it all, including the light rail corridor and the natural hazards. And that is something we've been talking about for all of those reasons that you listed. So the option 2 is closest to what you're talking about. And it was my decision not to put up any other option that went kind of more nuclear and, to say kind of don't do it at all, because that certainly is a political decision and we didn't think that would be helpful. John, if you've got anything else to add to that.
I think, Megan, just while you're in speaking to this, I'm not wanting anything other than as respectful, and it comes back to that importance of having strong, clear, contestable advice. But do you believe, Megan, that the Minister understands how much waste and how much of council's resources and the uncertainty that it has created for the community to not necessarily deliver the outcomes thus far? I know that nobody wants to offend the Minister, but I just feel that knowledge may be missing in all of this, that, why you didn't put an option up of option 4, so that there is absolute clarity around what some of us would like to see occur.
Look, I think he does have some understanding, and of course, I can only read what he writes, and to hear what he says in his speeches to reflect that. Currently, it is obviously we are prohibited in law to withdraw the whole plan change, but in his letter he acknowledges that Auckland does need a legislative change to enable this integrated process, which is going to, so that we don't keep kind of wasting money and time on what we're doing at the moment. So I do think he does have an understanding, Councillor Fletcher, that the current settings and where we're heading is not fit for purpose. Having said that, there will always be parameters, no doubt, to it. And so that's why option 2 needs to have legislative change, and that extension enables the government to do that, and for us to kind of reset then and still progress, but in a way that is far less wasteful on time, resources and money.
May I ask, please, have you or your officers or the Mayor have had face-to-face discussions with the Minister or the officers, his officers, on this, to ensure that he has a very clear understanding of the waste that has gone on?
We've been discussing quite consistently for months and months, as I know that you will understand, with Ministry for Environment officials and Ministry of Housing and Urban Development officials. So Ministry officials. I've not had a conversation with his office staff, but I do know that the Mayor has a meeting with Minister Bishop next week. So I think that's perhaps the first face-to-face that will occur.
Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor, thank you. Councillor Newman.
Good morning, John. Thank you very much for being here today. I have two questions. Firstly, what's your professional advice, your professional judgment as to how much development-ready capacity exists within the operative Auckland Unitary Plan? That's the first question. Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? Is it 30 years? And secondly, how much more capacity in that same time frame would be enabled if we agree option 2?
Yeah, through the chair. So under the NPS Urban Development, we're actually required to do that analysis and publish it. So not only were we required to do this Plan Change 78, we're also required to every, I think it's 3 years, produce a report on capacity for housing and employment in the unitary plan. And it takes a 3 or 4 tier approach. It starts off with if every site was developed to the maximum under the unitary plan, what's the capacity for housing, say? And then it puts a layer on what would the capacity be if you applied a market feasibility, a development feasibility lens to that, which starts to get a bit more subjective. There's also a clause in there about assumptions about would a developer actually build on that site? And then there's an assumption around infrastructure. So that big capacity figure gets knocked back under the NPS Urban Development. But in terms of this, the first question around capacity, we did the study, the report 2021, that concluded about 900,000 dwellings. So that would more than cater for population growth just in the residential areas, the suburban residential areas, not including the city centre opportunities for housing, all of the 10 metro centres, the town centres that allow some apartments above shops and so on. And we have a fair bit of what we call the mixed use areas in places like Newton, Eden Terrace, down Great South Road, that also allow for some residential. So they weren't in the mix. So if you just look at suburban residential, capacity for 900,000 in 2021. We're updating, we did a subsequent report and published it last year, which includes Plan Change 78. And you see that capacity go up quite significantly because of the walkable catchments going in, the medium density residential. We're just doing some analysis now on unitary plan has changed since 2021. We've had a number of private plan changes that have added more capacity. So we are updating that analysis now, and we'll have that for you in the near future. But yeah, the headline is in 2021, when we published the report, the plan-enabled capacity, as it's called, of the unitary plan in the suburban residential areas was 900,000 dwellings.
My follow-up, Chair, and it may be to John, or it may actually be to Megan. So at attachment E, the third para in the Minister's letter, the last sentence read, this requires Council to live zone for 30 years of housing growth, but gives them flexibility to decide on how that growth should happen. Essentially, I'm being told that, well, the understanding is that, well, the new benchmark is what is enabled as per what we're talking about. But what has just been told by the officers is that we already meet, in fact, we exceed the threshold that the Minister's setting out in his correspondence. Way more than the minimum threshold required here. This council can demonstrate ample capacity, and then we still have private plan changes coming through, which adds in, plus option 2. So my question is, how do we negotiate that with officials when it comes to the bill that's coming up? because what I would want to be seeing later this year will be a variation to Plan Change 78, which reflects the evidence that we have ample capacity, but we now need to reflect the limits to our infrastructure and the limits to what our communities will accept in outer suburban Auckland.
I'm not sure if there's that I can question, but look, completely agree, and that's exactly the kind of conversations we've been trying to have with ministry officials, and now with this new government and new minister, we have to keep progressing those, because it is ultimately whatever the government's focus is going to be, is it's going to have a massive implication on our infrastructure, particularly depending on how the minister defines what this 30-year capacity is. Is it the same definition as we've got now? Is it something different? Is it infrastructure enabled? Is it just live zoned? Is it, there's a whole bunch of questions which we don't know the answer to at the moment, but it's going to have significant impact on us.
Well, my one final, if I may, Chair. We have an evidence standard which demonstrates that we've done this quantitative assessment, applying the tiers to determine what is development ready. The officials don't have that. So when you provide that information to the officials, they say, well, that's nice, or do they say, well, we agree, or we don't agree? What do they say? What are the words? Because it's going to come down to this. We've got the evidence to show that we exceed the requirement that the minister set down himself. So if the officials don't accept that, then they need to come up with a different standard. But I don't think they can come up with that standard, because our evidence is better than theirs. What do the officials say? What are they saying? Do they agree with you or not?
Well, yes, they are accepting our evidence, particularly for that housing and in business assessment that John was talking about. Yes, they do. I think that they are still, also either working with or trying to understand where the minister is wanting to take this portfolio now that he's in it as well. So that's why things could change. I just don't know how they might change. But at the moment, yes, they're accepting that.
Perhaps, Chair, if I can just add, absolutely capacity is a core part of NPS urban development. It's a core part of the requirement for the plan change. But NPS urban development also talks about the benefits of intensification around in those walkable catchments around the metro centres, the city centre and the RTN stations. And it's sort of it's enabled the 30-year capacities already in NPS urban development.
Yes.
And in addition to that, and I think you may recall this from the previous term when Plan Change 78 was being developed, it's not as though you can stop at that point under the current NPS urban development. NPS urban development says, that's great, you've got the capacity, you can demonstrate that, and you also have to allow 6-storey buildings within the walkable catchments of the city centre, the 10 metro centres, and the rapid transit stations. So that's the way the NPS urban development is currently written. The government has signalled, or the minister, I can't recall whether it's a government statement or a ministerial statement, that NPS urban development is something that they are looking to review as well as MDRS, or in parallel. They are considering the NPS urban development, and that will be the vehicle that we get the clarity around what the minister means by capacity, what the government means by capacity, and so on. So just to note that at the moment it's an and it's a enable the 30 years and do the intensification, separate to medium density residential. Yeah.
Well, Chair,
which is a third requirement, sorry,
yeah,
and the medium density residential.
What the officer is essentially saying is, and there's no more question really, but we can already demonstrate that we've gone well beyond the minimum that's required, and in fact there's so much capacity now, there's an oversupply of capacity. So I don't quite know what more we need to do to meet or exceed what the minister's stating in his own correspondence, but hopefully a variation will be forthcoming. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. And we have asked for that clarification, and we are waiting, because there's also there's enabling supply for 30 years, but the minister's also said enabling supply basically ready now for 30 years. So that is two different things. And the other thing is that he's been clear in his speeches and letter to us that we need to box on with the NPSUD and the MDRS will be optional. And the Mayor's manifesto also said that the council supports the NPSUD, but we want the option for MDRS, and that essentially was pre-election. So, yeah.
If I may, Chair, I think I did reflect live zoned. My definition of this is live zone. It's live zone now if the developers will pay the cost of their developments. The only thing that's holding it up is their lack of willingness to pay the consequences of their own bloody developments. Thanks.
Very good point, Councillor. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, that's definitely a line of questioning I was going to go down. Thank you, Councillor Newman. I was exactly on the same page. And also with Councillor Fletcher about a potential option 4, which was pause all 76 work, including the city centre. But I think you've answered that for me, why that we've spent all this money. It would be silly to do that. But just on those hearings, does option 2 effectively allow a pause in the IHP hearings on implementing Plan Change 78 across most areas so that we can work with government on a better implementation that aligns with our up and out? Because I think that's important, you know. We've got some very important hearings coming up later. And I just want to know that that means that we actually stop.
Through the chair, it is essentially saying, other than the hearings that are finished on the city centre, we would be saying to the independent hearings panel, we don't believe there's much more you can get on with. There may be some very discrete topics that I think the hearings panel has signalled. There may be some topics that are just very discrete, probably small number of submitters, don't really get tied up with natural hazards or medium density residential. In fact, they've just finished a hearing this week, I think, on historic heritage places. So as part of Plan Change 78, Council had to re-justify all of the scheduled buildings, Town Hall, the 2,000 scheduled buildings. So those are the sort of topics that don't get too tied up in where MDRS goes, walkable catchments, natural hazards. So yes, 99%, but it may be that the panel feels that there are one or two very discrete things that could still go on. But the recent minute seems to signal that other than the city centre and the hearing they've just finished on the heritage places, they can't see much else. And
So
option 2 is recommending that we go back to the panel and say, we agree, but we would like you to make your recommendations essentially on the city centre at some point so that we can get that done and dusted. Yeah.
So you wouldn't go ahead with a special character one in June?
No.
Great,
that's
thanks.
Definitely not in scope of option 2.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Turner.
Thank you very much for a very complex subject that you need a career's worth of experience to master, and I will never get there at this age. I think Councillor Newman answered my questions, but just a question kind of on behalf of myself and the public, because when I'm out there talking to people, basically what they're saying is the unitary plan took ages and lots of money. It seemed to be fit for purpose. Then all of a sudden, it got gazumped by a whole bunch of other policies, which we're now struggling with. And we'd rather, stop the change while we grab our breath, have a cup of tea. So, is option 2 the closest thing that I can vote for, which is sensible, to option 4?
Through the chair, yes, absolutely. It's the closest to option 4, which isn't an option in the paper, but it's the Councillor Fletcher option I think you're referring to there. Yep, it's the closest to option 4. Yep.
Thanks. Councillor Henderson online.
Yes, thank you. I do have a couple of questions here. So firstly, just want to parse the minister's intention, because I think it's very important. I keep getting reminded about that at this table. So if the minister is requesting option 3, I mean, first of all, it seems that he is, but I just want to kind of confirm that. But if he is indeed requesting that as a government, won't they just change the law to allow that, or to overrule us if we go back and say, actually, you haven't got it right, Minister? So can we just clarify his intentions, and then what happens if we don't meet them?
Thanks, Councillor Henderson. Through the chair. So the minister's expectations talk about progressing policies 3 and 4 of the NPSUD, and that's the policies that relate to city centre, the metropolitan centres, the walkable catchments of those centres, intensification around some of our smaller centres are also in policy 3. And policy 4 is those qualifying matters that council's got in this plan change to say, well, there's a good reason not to allow that level of intensification. So the Minister was saying progress as much as possible, I think is the phrase, practicable. So essentially we're saying we don't believe, and the hearings panel doesn't believe, with all this uncertainty, that it's practicable to progress anything other than where the hearings panel has got to, which is really the city centre is done and dusted with the hearings panel, by and large. So we're agreeing with the hearings panel that that's as far as you can practically go without starting to cause all sorts of problems. So we think it's largely consistent with the Minister's expectation.
So just to be crystal clear, because it's a complex topic, option 3 best aligns to the government's intentions, right?
I think option 2 and 3 align to the government's intentions, but we would...
But 3 is best.
Our deeper analysis is that option 3 isn't practicable, so I guess you could say option 2, in our advice, best aligns with the Minister's expectations.
Okay.
Now,
That's
ministerial officials and the Minister may perhaps have a different view. We haven't had that conversation. The Mayor is meeting with the Minister next week. But our advice as officials is that that is the most practicable way forward, and option 3 is less practicable and therefore less in line with the Minister's expectations in the letter.
Okay. So what's practicable? There may be a dispute between council and the government on what's practicable. Is that where we're at?
I guess we'll know more after the Mayor's meeting with the Minister next week.
Okay. Okay. Cool. The other thing I want to check, because we don't live in isolation on this. We've got other cities that are handling the same situation. So Christchurch, second largest city in the country, what are they doing? I'm hearing whispers on what they're up to, but can we just get clarity, if you know, on how they're handling the situation?
I believe Christchurch is continuing on. They sought an extension of time. That extension wasn't granted, and they are continuing on. I think there's a bit more detail to it than that. I don't know if Megan, if you have any other information. But yeah, there are a number of councils caught in this position where they haven't concluded the hearings, they haven't made the plan change operative, and there are various discussions happening. I think it's Hamilton City is in a similar position, 1 or 2 other councils, but unfortunately I can't speak to too much detail around it.
Just adding to that, yeah. So Hamilton and Tauranga and Christchurch are still continuing. So we're talking about these tier 1 councils that we call them.
Yeah.
Yes, Christchurch did ask for an extension and they weren't granted it. And I think Tauranga are close to I think the independent hearings panel has completed or very close to completion. So they're kind of towards the end of the process. They'll be getting recommendations to their councils soon, as I understand it.
So Christchurch are boxing on with things like walkables.
Yes, I believe so.
All right. Sounds like a plan. Thank you.
Kia ora. Maybe just to clarify that, and as far as I understand it, Christchurch wasn't given an extension, but they were told keep pushing ahead with the walkables, but you could potentially change the MDRS. But our issue is that the Minister has basically given us our extension on a complex range of issues, but on the proviso that we continue with the walkable catchments. Is that?
As far as practical, and just to highlight the difference between Christchurch City and Tauranga City and Hamilton City, we're talking the Auckland region with many metropolitan centres, town centres, much more rapid transit stops, far more affected by the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and a much more complicated set of hearings. The impacts of the Cyclone Gabrielle and the Auckland anniversary floods last year, the decision to not include the light rail corridor until we knew where the stations were going to be, and then the confirmation that there won't be a light rail corridor. There's a far more complex situation in the Auckland region than there is for any of those other city or district councils.
Thank you. Councillor Ferry.
Thank you. So I'm trying to better understand the difference between options 2 and 3. Could we actually have those slides back up? I think that would be helpful. Thank you. Thanks. The key difference, yeah, I know. Thanks, Desley. It says option 2 at the start, so I'm good. So the key difference seems to be around the walkable catchments. Is that correct?
That's correct. Option 2 doesn't try and take walkable catchments any further, just the city centre zone and its various complicated precincts for things like the waterfront, the university and so on. But option 3 does that, but also tries to take forward the walkable catchments. It would be going back to the hearings panel and saying, well, hearings panel, we don't necessarily agree with your reservations. We think you can carry on and hear all of the submissions relating to all of the walkable catchments across the urban area, apart from the light rail corridor, because that's not in the plan change at this stage. And then you could progress those to make recommendations and council could make decisions. That would be option 3.
Okay. So with the walkable catchments, can we just flick to that slide? Is that okay? Thank you.
That's option 3.
The option 3 slide? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So the unaffected by natural hazards. So I'm wanting to understand, do we have a sense of what sort of proportion of the walkable catchments would be unaffected by the natural hazards? Are we talking about 80% are unaffected by natural hazards, 20%? Do we have a sense of the quantum there? Because that's, I think, quite an important part of the conversation.
Yeah, unfortunately, given the time frame to sort of respond to the Minister's extension and the hearings panel's response and to get something ready in time, we haven't done that analysis. I can see Phil Reid at the back of the room. So Phil hasn't done, the team haven't done the analysis yet. So yeah, unfortunately that is a missing piece. I suspect just about every walkable catchment has an overland flow path. So almost all of them will have some small perhaps area of flood risk.
Right.
And some will have significantly more, but I can't tell you, of the 40 or 50 walkable catchments, how many would be in and out, unfortunately.
So sorry, can you just say again how many walkable catchments we're talking about there? You just mentioned a number, 40 or 50.
You've got the 10 metropolitan centres, the city centre, and all of the train stations and the bus stops. It's probably 40, 50 walkable catchments, yeah.
Okay, and there may be an unknown portion of them that would be ruled out by this because they would have a natural hazard element.
Yeah, it will be a subset of all the walkable catchments.
We don't know that, but we are ruling out the ones where there's a natural hazard implication.
If you voted for that option, you'll be clear of natural hazards. You wouldn't be clear of the duplication of process if the council in the future decided to remove or modify medium density residential standards, because they are incorporated into those walkable catchments. So under this option, you may have a walkable catchment with no natural hazards. We would look to convince the hearings panel to box on and have the hearings. We present evidence. But a lot of the issues that submitters would raise would have a bearing on natural hazard, medium density residential standards, the various qualifying matters that all start coming into play. As you look at all the different walkable catchments, you'll start seeing landscapes, view shafts, ecological areas, all of those QMs that we worked through. People will have to present evidence on that. Council will be presenting evidence on that. Then that would all go through. You could make the plan change operative. And then when council does something with natural hazards and potentially something around MDRS, many of those issues would be raised by submitters again. And that's why we're saying that this one here does start to predetermine things for the light rail corridor. It starts to predetermine, it starts to add additional cost and duplication. And I guess because those walkable catchments include MDRS, people will be questioning why council is not waiting to see what the option is around MDRS and seeing where it lands with that.
Okay, so my next question then is about timeframes, because these processes, like the hearings process and stuff that happens downstairs, does actually move relatively slowly. So we do have an issue here about timing, where if we go for option 2 and say we're not going to include walkable catchments, and then central government actually gives us some direction quite quickly, then missed that opportunity? When would we be able to potentially put walkable catchments back on the table?
Well, if we get an indication from government around legislative change for natural hazards or something that would enable us to deal with natural hazards in this sort of process, and clarity around the MDRS fairly soon, and if the legislation is enacted by the beginning of next year, we feel we could be ready with some form of major variation to Plan Change 78 or some sort of replacement for Plan Change 78 outside the city centre, that by next April. We're sort of still working to a March, April next year public notification.
So sorry, just to clarify then, so because this excludes the natural hazards, so just talking about the walkable catchments that would still be in, so we're talking about fewer than 50, but we don't know how many fewer, but roughly. So we're talking about city centre plus fewer than 50 walkable catchments. Option 2 is just the city centre and not the walkable catchments.
Yep.
So that's it for me. I'm just trying to be clear here about the difference, because my concern is that we are missing some opportunities here, and we're actually going to have to come back and do option 3 once we have direction anyway. And then we've sort of, confused ourselves and wasted some time. So because my sense from the minister's letter is that, and what I'm hearing is that he potentially supports option 3. So I'm unclear about why we wouldn't go to option 3 now rather than, because we might have to shortly anyway.
Well, so a couple of issues. One is down the light rail corridor, there are some walkable catchments, and there's some parties with an interest in those walkable catchments who are not part of this process. So let's assume we just leave them out of the process for now. We don't do a variation to bring them in. So that option 3 doesn't talk about doing a variation for light rail corridor. It's just continue with the plan change as it is. So you've got parties who will have an interest in how wide a walkable catchment should be in general. Should it be 800 metres or a kilometre? And there'll be a lot of evidence from everyone else across the region or with an interest in a walkable catchment, and that'll all go to the hearings panel. But those parties aren't present. So there's a natural justice issue there, that once that decision is made on walkable catchments, well, if you're in the light rail corridor, you could potentially be, it could be perceived as predetermined. There is that issue. But
so sorry, can I just clarify that before, because this is quite complex planner speak here. So I'm just wanting to be really clear here. So you're saying that because if we go for option 3, decisions would be made about 800 metres, 900 metres, whatever, as a policy matter.
It's a policy and principle matter, yep.
And then that would apply within the light rail corridor, even though we wouldn't have had anybody able to submit.
It would carry significant weight in any future process to bring it into play. It wouldn't be legally binding, but I guess it would be, if that analysis has been undertaken by the panel, the council has considered the recommendations and landed on a position, then that's almost certainly going to be the same position for the light rail corridor, but those parties aren't present. That's one of the issues with progress with option 3.
Okay.
The other one is that the medium density residential standards are woven into the text of Plan Change 78 for the zones that apply in the walkable catchments.
Yep.
So there's a whole lot of technical complexity in the drafting of the rules that could potentially be simplified when we know what the option is around MDRS and when the council makes decisions around what to do with that option. In progressing the walkable catchments, you're not just progressing the distance of a walkable catchment, you're progressing aspects of the rules in the unitary plan for zones like the terrace and apartment zone, our new low density residential zone that we've had to create. So hearing all the evidence on those things, and then potentially having to hear all of those issues again if the council takes an option around MDRS in the future and sort of looks at extracting parts of MDRS from the rules. So it is very complicated. I mean, I and others find it very complicated as well. There's so many overlaying parts, but in simple terms, MDRS is on this point is interwoven into the walkable catchments. So are qualifying matters. So again, council will be starting to make decisions about qualifying matters as they relate to walkable catchments. That's things like view shafts, landscape issues, various other things that are qualifying matters for the walkable catchments, but the parties who are outside of that, are they involved, aren't they involved? So that's why the option we're recommending is that single integrated process where we can look at all of these things. And I think the more you progress parts of 78 in its current form, even these walkable catchments, the more we're starting to complicate things, trip ourselves up for any future process.
Sorry, I do have another query. So which of these options would enable more housing in line with our sort of compact city ambitions? I acknowledge the point that's been made about 900,000. However, some of those are not in the right place to align with our compact city ambitions. So is moving ahead with the walkable catchments as a priority in option 3 going to be unlocking more housing faster along our frequent transport?
So the quantum, we can say, would be the same, subject to any future decision that council might make on walkable catchments under option 2. So in terms of how much housing, we could say arguably equal.
But the timing.
But it's the time frame.
Yeah.
So it's probably a year to 18 months faster, I guess, than the sort of integrated process that we've referred to, which, subject to the government changing the legislation this year and enacting it early next year, could be notified by next March or April, and then it would have to go through a year, 18 months, potentially slightly longer process. So it's hard to pin it down exactly, but it's probably in that 18 months, 1 to 2 year difference in time. But let's not forget there is significant capacity for housing in the existing walkable catchment areas under the operative unitary plan without Plan Change 78. There is a lot of 5, 6 and 7 story terraced housing zoning around many of the centres, but certainly not all of them. So, yeah.
Okay, sorry, last question, just to go back to the natural hazards aspect. So I'm just wanting to understand then, is there a tipping point where the natural hazard, Phil and I met about a particular area which is actually in the light rail corridor, so it won't be a factor in this particular conversation, but it was really helpful for me understanding the impact that the natural hazard work may have on some of those walkable catchments. So I've got that in the back of my mind. And so when we're talking here about the natural hazards, are we talking about, if 10% of the walkable catchment would be impacted by natural hazards? Are we talking about we would draw a line for that walkable catchment that excluded the portion that would be impacted by the natural hazards? That's what I'm trying to understand in that space.
And again, given the time, we really haven't dived into the detail and done the analysis to know exactly how you would progress option 3 for those walkable catchments. So that may be something that if the committee was in favour of option 3, we would have to have some process, a delegation perhaps, to define exactly what you're saying around how much of a walkable catchment has to be unaffected by a hazard before council has a position of carrying on. So I can't see any other way, if the committee goes for option 3, than to have a delegation to deal with that level of detail.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Got Councillor Lee, then the Mayor, then Councillor Turner. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions have been more or less answered, and so I'll reserve my slot for comment. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor. Mayor Brown.
Thanks for that. This is very complex. I will be supporting option 2. I think that you've laid out the need to finish the city. What nobody's mentioned is the fact that there is right at the moment, the market is dead as hell. We've got 900,000 approved sites, nobody wanting to buy them. So rushing ahead in the lack of clarity strikes me as most unwise. My question is, I have this meeting with the Minister. I want clarity when we have it. Too many questions can just make this as murky as the muddy waters of some of our streams. I'm not interested in going down the rabbit hole of other cities. I think your answer is pretty good. This is a regional government. The others are towns. I'm doing my best to remind the government of that. And so, councillors, please wake up. What happens in Hamilton has no bearing on what happens in Auckland at all. So my question is, will you be available to, I don't want you to be in the meeting, but sitting outside when the minister comes, so if it does get too complex, I can drag you in. But I think he's a simple soul. He was trying to get through a change that he was elected to force. I think they're a bit embarrassed about the rush that MDRS was shoved on top of everybody. There is no, we do have a very large walking catchment with all the infrastructure in place, which is the city right now. And more people in here would be a damn good thing. So, and my biggest risk for the council is new developments ahead of infrastructure where the developers don't pay for all the infrastructure. And so I want you, I'm asking you to be available with simple tools for them when I'm meeting the minister to save us from that last risk of a head-on rush into development for which there is no market and even worse, no infrastructure and developers who don't want to pay for it all. So that's my question. You're going to be there? Thank you.
The Chief of Strategy and I will certainly make ourselves available to sit outside the meeting. Yeah, absolutely. We will be there.
Yeah, I know you want to be there, but you've got to be concentrating on simplicity.
Yeah.
I mean,
it is.
You can drag yourself into a hole here. We are not like other places. And this is what I want.
Yeah.
Thank you. No. Councillor Turner.
Thank you for a second chance, Mr. Chair. And simplicity, yeah, that's what I like. Look, I just wanted to, all this talk about walkable catchments and natural hazard areas and all that sort of stuff. West Auckland is the most affected by these walkable catchments because it's enforcing built-up increased housing, which is changing the ambience of the place. It's pushing people in where we've just not prepared for them. The Te Aratu Peninsula, I know some people say I'm only listening with one ear, but the people I'm talking to seem to be talking in both ears. Te Aratu is, we seem to not be realising that putting people vertically has a horizontal problem. And, you know, there's, so where, when do I get a chance, or where in this can you start as a councillor to advocate for reducing those intensification areas?
Oh, it's a tricky one, that. So we have done some analysis on, so the development that you're talking about is under the unitary plan before this plan change, really. So it's development that's actually largely in accordance with the unitary plan pre-plan change 78 intensification. And the monitoring that we undertaken, and we reported back to the last term of council, indicated that some of our design standards needed to be improved to get better quality development. We weren't looking at necessarily reducing any of the heights or densities, but we felt that some of the rules around setbacks and boundaries, landscaping, privacy and so on needed to be fine-tuned. But when the medium density residential standards came over the top in legislation, we couldn't progress that work any further. So with the government making it clear that medium density residential standards will be optional, with some caveats, I'm sure. One of the issues we'd like to explore when we know more about that with yourselves is are some of those design standards able to be improved? So the heights and density issue is a bigger strategic conversation, but in terms of just getting better quality, if there is an option around MDRS, that would enable us to look at improving some of the quality of the outcomes.
So are you saying it's the fast tracking that that's been the problem that we've incurred recently? There seems to have been a peak of of issue. And I'm just trying to work out what's caused that peak. I'm surprised that you've said the unitary plan had got this thing rolling forward anyway. That was something I didn't understand, but that didn't bring this peak a problem that the public's seeing. So is it just the fast tracking aspect of what we're doing?
No, I don't believe what you're seeing in West Auckland or elsewhere is fast tracking under the COVID legislation or anything like that. I guess what you're seeing is that the potential of the unitary plan created for more development than the former Waitakere City Plan or the Auckland City Plan or the Manukau Plan. The unitary plan does allow a lot more development than previously. Most of it is happening in the right place. There may be some in locations that aren't that well served by public transport, but I think what you're seeing is unitary plan in effect, and we know that there are some improvements that we could make to the unitary plan, but we can't make them until the legislation has changed. So, yeah, once the legislation has changed, we'll know whether we can make some improvements.
Through the chair, could I just add, there's another few things happening. We've had significant and sustained population growth in Auckland historically over the last decade or more, and it's continuing. A lot of our infrastructure, if we think across the region, could be 50 to 70 years old. So that's kind of coming. We've got our population, whether that's our those that have been here for a while or migrant populations, people coming in who want to live in different ways, have different options for housing. And so all of that is I think, creating what you're seeing now, and the more unaffordability of infrastructure for council, the lack of funding and financing tools we have. There's a whole bunch of reasons. So I think for me, it's a bit of a perfect storm of what we've got. It's a real opportunity. But the unitary plan is also wanting to provide the kind of development opportunities that people want to see, and they're starting to take it up.
Thank you. Councillor Darby.
Thank you, John. Thanks for your advice today, both the written and orally here. Just picking up on a point you've just made, I'm interested in looking at that opportunity with impending legislative change of revisiting something that we didn't win when we were submitting to Select Committee, and that is around the need for national design standards. You'll recall that we came very close to convincing some key politicians on that, but then it was gazumped. And we have a situation in Auckland, we hear a lot from Aucklanders about the quality of design, of intensive developments lacking. We are aware now that we've not just been successful in creating warm, dry homes, we're creating hot, dry homes. Overheating of developments is just one well-documented problem that we're facing. There are a number of things. So my key question to you now, and Megan, you and I have discussed this as well, is there opportunity for us to advocate at this stage, considering that there's going to be legislative change, for government to explore the introduction of national design standards, and for government to be informed by industry, the design professions, Institute of Architects, etc. In your view, is this an opportune time to revisit that?
Through the chair, I think that's definitely worth exploring as part of this ongoing engagement with the government around changes to the RMA to provide the option around medium density residential standards. In parallel with that, could we be having a conversation to have some different, better standards that are nationally there as guidance or requirements, perhaps? The other option, of course, is if the legislation has changed in a way that council can go back to its old 3-storey medium density, the mixed housing urban zone, and make some improvements. So we would create our own suite of standards, improve the mixed housing urban zone, which is our 3-storey medium density zone that the MDRS was largely based on, then, you know, we could go it alone and then set some standards that others could adopt. So I think both options are viable, sensible, worth exploring. But I think the key headline is that the MDRS, we had some issues and council submitted on concerns about the standards themselves. They're more permissive than the mixed housing urban zone that we already have. And we knew that mixed housing urban had some issues because we monitored that, reported that back to the last term of council. So hopefully there's a way forward where we can get some standards that are better than both. And if they can be applied nationally, that would be great. But if Auckland Council can apply them in Auckland, that will be good for Auckland anyway. Yep.
So just time is of the essence and the legislative program moves very quickly. So can I just come to you, Megan? I don't want to just bolt on a motion here today. I'd actually like us to think this through. So what guidance, sorry, John and Megan, what guidance can you provide us as to how we might go about addressing the outstanding question of quality? Now, we've talked about quantity for years. Our Aucklanders continue to tell us they've got big concerns about quality, and the evidence is starting to come in on that. How do we grapple with that and take advantage of the new government's legislative agenda?
That's a great question. I think and John touched on it, I think it is through any kind of RM reform that this government kicks off, which I believe will be later in the year or earlier next year. They're kind of phase 3. They were coming into their phase 2 now, with the legislation change that John's been talking about. So there's opportunities there. There could be opportunities coming in the change that for councils to opt out of the MDRS. I don't know around that whether there's some quality matters that could be part of that legislation change. I'm not sure. That's the immediate one. So I think there's something we can do there as we actually understand what that legislation could look like and any of those parameters the government has about opting in or opting out. And I guess the other element is, as we are moving towards our review of the unitary plan, one of our work streams is around the quality, the design requirements. So there's continued work that we can do, you know, internally for ourselves, not even at a national level, about the design standards and requirements for Auckland.
So do you think we should be steering it today? I mean, I can understand the unitary plan review is further out. I'm talking about some more immediate opportunities. So do you think we should steer it today, or we're ill-equipped to steer it today?
It's really in your hands. It's clear to me that I would be very happy to, the next time I work with the ministry, talk with the ministry officials and working in with any legislative change that's coming, to include that in our conversations and ask directly when is the time, when is the scope that they're working to for this. So I'm happy to do that without any resolution from the committee. If you want something more, then you might want to instruct, you know, something different. But at this stage, I'm happy to do that as we're looking in this next 6 months of legislative program that the government's got. I'll include it in that.
Oh, thought Councillor Sayers online.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I guess just following up on the points made by Councillor Darby there, my question would be to the officers around housing affordability. If we add national building standards and design standards, what does that do to the housing affordability or the cost of a home? I'm just a little bit concerned that we might be increasing the cost of housing by insisting on this type of standard being implied or applied.
Through the chair, the sort of analysis, the research that we did that was presented at the last term of council about how well the unitary plan was working in terms of quality indicated that some fine tuning of the standards was justified, and then the MDRS crashed over the top and prevented that from happening. So it's more in the nature of fine-tuning rather than anything that would significantly, from a planning resource consent point of view, add significant cost. So obviously anything that council does in terms of changing the unitary plan, we have to do a cost-benefit analysis, so that will be looked at. But I think we're talking about fine-tuning standards. We're not talking about detailed building consent or engineering standards or anything like that. It's really just the bulk and location of building, landscaping. Yes, there may be some additional costs, but we think they'll be fairly modest in the overall scheme of things and have minimal or no effect on housing affordability.
Well, very good answer. Thank you, John, for clarifying that.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor. Are there any other questions before we go to them? Might go to the recommendations and then have a quick 5-minute. Councillor Stewart.
Just in light that we're going to lose a couple of members soon, we're going to another meeting and then they're coming back, and this is so important, could we actually adjourn this part of the meeting so we can vote on it when everybody is able to be back in the room?
No, I think we need to progress it. I'm going to give people a break, but I think... Yeah, but we don't know how long. I mean, with all due respect, we don't know how long that might be, and this Thursdays are always the committee meeting, so we can't. Other people have to leave later. Yeah. Councillor Bartley, you have a question?
Oh, thank you. Just a question. I'm not a planner. I am really actually struggling with this item, but I just wanted to know. So it seems like option 2 may be the go. And I wanted to know, it says the disadvantage is areas outside of the city zone would not be enabled until mid-late 2026. But in my area, we already have high-rise apartment buildings going up in our neighbourhood. So does this mean nothing to those areas? Is this really just trying to protect those other areas that don't have high density?
No, through the chair, it's saying the existing opportunities under the unitary plan right across Auckland would continue. So there are many opportunities for terraced housing, apartment buildings right across the region. That carries on. But the extra intensification that this plan change allowed outside the city centre would be paused for a while until some new process or plan change or a variation takes place. So all those existing opportunities that you're talking about, they wouldn't be stopped. It's not like we're going back to pre-unitary plan. So the point I made before, there are many opportunities for terraced housing, apartment buildings right across the region, and that would carry on. You'd still continue to see that. It's not like stepping right back pre-unitary plan. It's really just letting the unitary plan continue on, city centre continue on, and then a pause while we figure out what to do and we see the legislation change, work with government, and then those extra opportunities that Plan Change 78 brings about, some of those or all of those would come into play again at that point in time. So it's yeah, hopefully that's clear. There'll still be many opportunities for housing right across the urban area under the existing unitary plan.
Thank you, Councillor. Right, there are no more questions. I'll just move, and the Mayor is going to second. Essentially, listening to the room, it sounds like pretty much option 2 is where we've landed. Councillor Lee, did you have a question on line? Or you?
No question, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a comment at the appropriate time, please.
Thank you, Councillor. I have added a Chair's Rec D, which you're welcome to support or not support. But I think the issue for me, I will speak to it properly, but I'm just showing you so you can have a think about it while we have a break, is that the Minister has been very clear around his expectations on the direction to Auckland Council, the statement of expectation, which is to do D, essentially, which is to try our best to not delay that part. They are not changing the MPSUD, they're only giving us options on the MDRS, so I think with our discussions, we at least have to show we are trying to be in line with what, because we don't want to end up like Christchurch, where they're not allowing us any delay at all. The delay has been given provisos. So that's where we are sitting. We're just going to have a 5-minute adjournment to toilet or cup of tea. Oh, sorry. We had finished questions, but we might go back to Councillor Fletcher. She has a question.
Thank you, Chair. My question would be to John Dogood along the lines of the Chair has foreshadowed that the mood seems to be in and around option 2. In the detailed report from the officers, would consideration be given to some of those issues that you've heard canvassed today? I mean, from my perspective, it's all just a muddle, and we do need to have clarity. And so within the report, the scope of the work that you have, would you highlight the fact that that would continue to be an option, or a possibility is better than an option?
Through the Chair, Councillor Fletcher, just clarification. So you're speaking to the Chair's additional recommendation, and yeah.
No, I'm not. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I didn't. Yep. When I wanted to pose a question, it was before I saw what the Chair has put up. This was simply based on the 3 options that you have very carefully outlined, and I'm very grateful for that. I had thought of an amendment. I think it's better for us to come together as a council and not muddy the waters, so to speak, even further, because it's so muddled. But if there is an appetite for the majority of councillors to come behind one option, and the Chair is suggesting that might be 2, I just want to know that there is a paper trail that highlights the complexity and the muddle that this whole thing has been, and that opportunity is still open to the government of the day, that Plan Change 78 could be withdrawn for all the reasons you've sort of heard and we've been skirting around.
Yeah, through the Chair, you know, the Minister on behalf of the government has given a strong signal that, you know, those policy 3-4 aspects are really important to progress. So it's said it's very unlikely that a complete withdrawal would ever be enabled by the government. But in terms of what the Chair has put forward here, it's essentially option 3, isn't it? It's to include, well, it's city centre and look at progressing option 3 for the walkable catchments as well. Is that how you describe it, Chair? Just.
I think Councillor Fletcher's question wasn't directly on that. Everything is option 2, apart from we're asking the independent. We are stuck in a position where we have to rely on a minister to change a legislation to allow us to do these things. He's given us provisos to change them, and I feel like if we don't at least go back to the independence hearing panel, so they, as they've said in their minute, they're confused, then he will realise that we can't do all of the things he's asking without, as maybe Councillor Fletcher says, or maybe someone else has said before, we can't do all of these things without legislation change. My concern is if we don't follow the statement of, what was it called? Statement of expectations, then we may end up where Christchurch is, just being told, no, you don't get an extension. So my issue is that the Mayor is meeting with them next week. So yeah.
Maybe through the Chair, just to answer what I understand.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I was just going. I've explained that I'm not deliberations on the directors for Auckland Transport until this matter is concluded. So I just hope that the officers can work around that, and perhaps one of the officers could explain to me your during the short break that you're going to take.
We can do that, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So we'll come back at 11:36 I think that is. We'll give 5 or 6 minutes break to cup of tea or bathroom stop.